Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Product Tales podcast. In this episode, I had the privilege of sitting down with Rowan Oulton, who has been under the hood of two iconic high growth software companies, Vend and Slack. Now, as the CEO and co founder of Prosaic, Rowan shares his incredible journey through software and product development. But before we dive in, here's a quick word from a sponsor, Dummy. Dummy is a Chrome extension that helps product teams create instant, one-click bug reports with video replay and technical info, making it super easy to share and solve software issues fast when you're testing software. Click the link on the show notes to get started for free today, or go to dummy.com. That's dummi.com. All right. Thanks for joining us today, Rowan.
How you doing?
For us to get started, how about you start by telling me a little bit more about how you got into software and product development in the first place?
Yeah, so I think I was lucky in the sense that we always had computers around the house growing up. My parents had like an IT related business, so there were always just free computers scattered around, and I can't remember a time where I wasn't like comfortable booting into them and using them, playing around with them. As a kid, you think that everything in your life is normal. So I just normalized that, and I realized that, not everyone has that kind of access. So that was probably the first thing that lined me up for a career in software and in product development. But it wasn't really until we got into high school, we started having programming classes that things really clicked for me. And then around like the early, I'm dating myself here, but like around about the early 2000s, there's this game called RuneScape, which was like I feel like it was one of the first truly big online multiplayer games. It was like a Java app that you could play in the browser. It was like medieval game where you have to like collect resources and you can fight people. And I just loved it, like all me and my friends from school, we all played it religiously. But it was a really tedious game, like really tedious. You just had to click, and all of the kind of resource gathering was super algorithmic and boring. But the fun parts of the game required that you did all this work so that you had the stuff to actually go and have fun. And so there was this huge kind of motivation to automate that. And it was also, because it was a Java app, you could reverse engineer it and kind of crack open the client and make it and change it and then play with it. So that was what really got me interested. And I think that was probably the thing that led me to understand the economic value of programming, in the sense that like a friend of mine and I wrote a bunch of scripts to automate gameplay, and we gathered in-game resources and we sold that to people for like real money. And like my mum thought I was a drug dealer, had this like shoebox full of loose cash. But yeah, that's kind of the genesis. So it just stemmed from there. I think I went to uni for a bit and got a job in advertising and then ended up in startups. And that's the progression of getting into web development. It felt like the collision of these two really fun worlds, where it's like you can build a computer, you can tell a computer what to do, but then you can distribute that to anywhere in the world, like instantly, which is, I still find amazing.
I love that. You probably not the first person that got into software development because of RuneScape.
Totally.
I know quite a few people that have done that. And tell me about the story of how you got your first job in a software product role.
Yeah, I feel like my first true like, startup job was at Vend, and I've been working in advertising for a while, and then I went out contracting, and I met this guy Vaughan, who was the founder of Vend, and he had sort of started Vend on the side of his other contracting business, and he was just looking for someone to pick up the slack, take on the contracting work while he focused on Vend. So I helped him out occasionally with that, and he was always kind of like, "Hey, you should come and work on Vend, and I'm building for the product. I need some help. Like, I'd love you to be on the team." And I'm kind of like, I'm good, young. I was just enjoying contracting and the flexibility of all that stuff. But eventually, he got it to a point where he had raised a seed round and he was building a team. And to his credit, like, he was just really persistent, and he did hire really well. That initial team was awesome. And I knew a couple of the folks that were coming in, and there was enough to take the jump.
What number of employees were you at Vend? You were quite early then.
Or was it contentious? I don't actually know. Like, it depends on if you count Vaughan and his partner at the time. So I think it was like in the first 5 or something like that. But it was really murky because like people were contracting and then they weren't, and like, so I don't know. But yeah, like from the very beginning, essentially.
And so just to give also everyone context, what stage of size were they at when you left?
Yeah, so I was there for about 4 years in all, and when I left, I want to say there was about 200 people, and that was I think we had an office in Toronto. I think they'd just opened an office in Berlin. There might have been an office in Australia, I can't recall, but yeah, so mostly still headquartered, and most of the people were in Auckland. There's a lot of growth in 4 years for sure.
So you joined the team like quite early, and you built basically the foundation of their whole software. How do you think that your approach to software development has changed as the team grew and the company gained traction, and you went from 5 to 200 employees?
Yeah, it's some great questions. I think like any really early stage kind of fast growing company, when we started, it was a lot more of a free for all. It was just like you get handed a laptop, you pick a desk and you just start coding. And for me, like I came out of advertising, which was even more like rapid and fast and loose. Then was definitely the first time that I'd been exposed to real engineering. It was just like you're building a product to last, it's a long running thing. But even like in the beginning, like I said, it was like a free for all. Vaughan had done this Herculean effort to build up this product on his own. And he started to get traction and started to grow really, really quickly. And we brought the initial team on it. We spent so much time just like staying alive. It was just hard to keep up with the growth. But I think what really changed over the kind of the time that I was there is that we really did introduce a lot more rigor about everything. We had established patterns of revision control and code review. And we brought in like a layer of engineering management, which we didn't have in the early days. And then that flowed through into how we developed product. We got a lot more product design help, had product managers, but also the way that we would build and ship product improved a lot. I really cringe thinking about the way that I would deploy feature changes. Like you would build up this huge branch until it was ready to go. Then you'd ship it all at once. And inevitably a change that large is going to break something. And then you'd scramble to. And I learned my lesson the hard way. We had some really brilliant engineers come in the early days. Like there was Dom Sherlink, Mick Walker, Dono Radich. These guys are just like incredibly smart. Mal Curtis was another one. And they brought a lot of like maturity to how we did things. Like I remember shortly after I deployed this major feature with my team and things had blown up really badly, watching John, who was on the back end side of things, shipping a big change of his, and it was like mind blowing. He put everything behind feature flags, which was a concept that I wasn't super familiar with up until that point, which is so obvious now, but very new to me. His deploys were basically risk free. It's like everything was out in production, but it was kind of hidden away, and he got to test it all beforehand. And then deploying the thing was just flipping a boolean somewhere, right? Like flipping a switch and it's out. So yeah, we definitely had to mature a lot. That was made harder by the fact that we were like growing so fast and just trying to keep up with things.
So it sounds like at the beginning you're like build fast, break things, and over time as you gain a customer base, it became more and more important to make sure that things didn't break so often when you were releasing code. Besides the feature flags, were there any other kind of systems that you put in place or that you saw that were put in place that really helped overall with your work and also the quality of the code base?
There are a lot of things, but I feel like they're all very well known now, but perhaps they were less so in the early 2010s. Like we brought in a really great team of QA testers. We had a growing set of unit and integration tests that we didn't really have before. None of these things are super like controversial. They're kind of table stakes, I feel now. But yeah, like that stuff all really helped us just feel a bit more confident about what we were doing and when things went out. But yeah, you're totally right. Like it was that classic arc of you're just trying to stay alive in the early days. And I think we'll get to this a bit later when we talk about tech debt, but like you take on a lot of tech debt in that progress. And then the narrative flips to like, okay, we have a lot of customers and we need to keep them happy. And so you do things differently.
Let's start talking a little bit about tech debt since you brought that up. How did you deal with the tech debt that you guys acquired at Vend? 4 years scaling that fast, you probably acquired quite a bit of it. Do you have any challenges or any thoughts on this one?
Absolutely. Like the thing, when I think about tech debt, the thing that comes up for me is tech debt is inevitable and it's constant. I've never worked anywhere where it doesn't exist. And that's okay. I think earlier in my career, I was really worried about that. And I think a lot of people do get really hung up on this notion that there's this huge specter of tech debt. And granted, you do need to like kind of keep it under control, because if you don't address any of it, like everything's going to grind to a halt. But it is the result of choosing growth over, thoroughness. And often that's the right decision to make. Like when you're an early company, the growth is the important thing, right? You need to optimize for that. And so I think that tech debt is the hallmark of most, if not all, fast growing startups, and that's totally fine. It is painful for sure. And I think there's always this tension between needing to keep a lid on it a little bit, but also needing to push ahead anyway. And I don't think there's any golden rule or silver bullet around how you do that. It's very contextual, and very hard to get right. I haven't experienced a company that's done it perfectly ever. Then did some of it well and some of it poorly, and same with Slack. Like it's really hard.
Yeah, you mentioned Slack as well, and we haven't talked about your time at Slack yet, and I'm really excited to dive into that. But thinking about tech debt and your time at Vend and your time at Slack, and now with your own startup, do you find that customers now expect so much more from software companies because there's so much more higher quality software out there that maybe going fast and breaking things and acquiring a lot of tech debt is not as sustainable for startups?
100%. Yeah. And I think I've read a lot about Linear, for example. Their product journey was very much like they probably spent, they're kind of slightly antithetical to that whole move fast to break things. And I think you're right. Like in Linear's example, I know that they spent an inordinate amount of time upfront building a really good syncing engine so that everything would work offline and give themselves a really good foundation to have great like developer experience around then building out the product. And their reasoning for that was because they are essentially they're a replacement for existing tools as opposed to a new tool. And so to stand out, you need to be super stable. You need to genuinely be, considerably better than the competition. So I think that is a reflection of the fact that because there is so much software out there now, you're often entering market, unless you're really lucky with your idea, you're almost always going to be entering a market which is probably quite saturated already. And so the bar is definitely higher. And certainly with Prosaic, our journey has been like, you do still need to optimize for growth, even though that is a reality of needing stability at top. I think one of the saving graces of building software in 2024 is that the resources at your disposal are so far advanced to what they were 5-10 years ago. Sometimes I feel more like a plumber than like an architect or anything. You're evaluating the pieces to put together rather than building the pieces, There are pros and cons about that, but one of the pros, of course, is that you often get a lot more stability baked in because, for example, you might pull down a package or use a piece of software which is already quite mature, has a lot of testing, et cetera, et cetera. And so that increases the stability of your service on turn. But yeah, I agree. It's a tricky one. Like I think there is a rethink coming around that.
For sure. And when building Prosaic now, what are some of the things that you were thinking about to make sure that you implement early on that perhaps in the past you haven't implemented and resulted in a lot of tech debt pain for you?
Oh man, I think the difference between where I was at in my early career and now later on is that you do know which things are really important to worry about early and which aren't, and when to worry about them. I think one of the early challenges we had at Venn was that we didn't shard our databases early enough, and that really hurt. And again, you don't want to shard too early because you're bringing on a lot of unnecessary complexity and you spend a lot of time on something which you're not certain you're going to need. If your company doesn't survive until the end of the year, you probably shouldn't spend time sharding. Through your career, as you have more experience, you start to build a greater intuition for when is the right time to do it. My experience so far is often later than you think. Certainly, one of the things I learned working at Slack was that, you can build a really successful company with a very simple set of tools or a simple architecture. You don't need to go super deep. And so that's always in the back of my mind, like when you're building new software, it's kind of like, I think it's easy to get caught up in what stack you choose, what programming languages, the frameworks, but none of that really matters. That's something that I've come to later in my career. It's like, there's a lot of kind of religious wars about these tools, and actually what matters is what you give to people, and how you get there is usually a function of what's familiar to you. And there's obviously pros and cons everywhere, but like most things can do most things now, which I don't necessarily think was true 20 years ago, but probably is now.
Is it what you're saying that user experience trumps any kind of technology that you might be dealing with in the background? So even if the technology is not the latest piece of tech, if the users are having a really good user experience, the software is high quality, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And also like just not taking the decisions about which technology you use too seriously, or not fretting about them so much. I think
Mm.
this is a mistake I've seen early stage companies make repeatedly. You kind of get mired in, oh, should I use this? Should I use that? Like these decisions could blow up really big later down the line. The thing to remember is that if you are successful and you get down the line, you'll have a whole team of people to help you with that. Like if you did make the wrong decision, and inevitably you will make some wrong decision, and that's okay. I certainly have relaxed a lot. Just obviously spend some time evaluating things, be smart about your decisions, but don't stress. If you've made the wrong call, if you succeed, it'll be okay.
If you're winning, everything else is easier. That's for sure. And so speaking of winning, let's dive into your time at Slack. So tell me the story about how you got into Slack in the first instance, and yeah, how long you were there for and what you were doing for them.
So my mum was American, so I've always had a connection to the country, and obviously through her, I was lucky enough to get a passport. And so working in tech, I'd always thought, like San Francisco is kind of Mecca, right? Like it's the center of the tech universe. I'd always aspired to work there. And I was sitting on this golden ticket because for New Zealanders, it's really hard to get to America. It's really, really hard. And here I was with a passport. I could just waltz straight in. So I started interviewing, and man, interviews in the States are brutal. It's like an art unto itself, really high pressure, really stressful. It was miserable, like, honestly. If any of your listeners are interested on advice, I'd be happy to talk to them. It is just really hard, and I had never experienced anything like it. I think New Zealand's probably more like that now. I don't know, but certainly at the time, that was all new to me. You're doing like 6 hours back to back of like live coding exercises in front of people, or online or in person. It's just exhausting, and it's a skill that feels completely unrelated to what the job actually is. It's like, I want you to implement Dijkstra's algorithm like on a whiteboard right now. I'm going to need to do that in a job. Anyway, I get why they do it, but I found that really frustrating. So anyway, I went through all these interviews, and at the start of the process, I'd sent a cover letter and an application to Slack, but because they were so like the hot startup, they were just buried in applications, and they didn't get back to me till the very end of that process when I already had a few offers and I'd already like learned the ropes, I think. And so I went to interview, and their interview process was amazing. It was incredibly humane. They had like take-home coding exercise. I feel like they had to build like an image gallery or something, and you submit like a Git repo, and that's what the test of whether you get an on-site interview was, which was awesome, right? Because you can spend as much or as little time as you want to know. You're in the comfort of your own home, your own computer. They ended up offering the job, and so we moved over in mid 2016, and the company would have been like probably. It was still very early on, like maybe 300-ish people, something like that. But yeah, so we went to it for them in San Francisco and ended up being there for about 7 years.
Wow. 7 years is a long time. You saw them through quite a growth phase of their company, even though they're quite big already, they kept growing quite rapidly, right? In the last 7 years.
I didn't keep track of the numbers, but even a couple of years after I had joined, the company was probably a few thousand people. So we were like 10x the staff in a pretty short space of time. And then we went public, and shortly after that, Salesforce acquired us, and they're like, this gargantuan corporation. I feel like they have 20,000 staff or something. So like going from a few hundred people to this 10,000 plus person behemoth was like, it was wild.
So tell me a little bit about the nature of the work that you were doing for them and how that evolved over time. And any key takeaways from your time there? Anything unexpected that you learned?
Yeah. So when I joined what was called the Grid team, which was the name for their enterprise product. So when they originally conceived of Slack, the assumption that the original team made was that it was probably for small teams, smallish companies with maybe up to 100, 150 people. And what they pretty quickly realized is that actually huge corporations were using this, and they were having workspaces with tens of thousands of people in them. At the same time, they realized that the real money was in the enterprise deals. And so they kind of reoriented the company a little bit to selling that. And, part and parcel of selling to enterprises that you have a whole suite of enterprise grade administration tools. And so that was the team that I joined. And I spent about 6 months on that. And then around about that time, we were starting to have some kind of stability difficulties related to bringing on these huge customers, right? You're trying to fit 100,000 person companies into this software that was designed for maybe like 100 people, and it just was, things were breaking. And so the company kind of recognized that they needed an infrastructure team, people to take care of that kind of lower level of software that the feature teams would then build on top of. Because it was like hired in as a front-end engineer, and Slack was really heavy on the front, like a lot of the software written was in the clients. So we had an infrastructure team, which was largely back-end focused, but there was an arm of it that I was a part of, which was like infrastructure for front-end. You've kind of the back end of the front-end, and that encompasses everything from the libraries that we would write for people to interact with our APIs, all the way down to like the build tools. Like when I joined, because Slack's deploy process was essentially to just concatenate a bunch of JavaScript files written in jQuery and just put that up on S3 and you're done. And while we were there, we migrated to React, and that necessitated bringing in like build tools. So we evaluated a bunch of them and brought in Webpack, and that build tools is kind of where I spent most of my time there on. And then that kind of morphed into more of like a developer experience role.
So, what were your main takeaways from your time there, and anything unexpected that you learned?
Yeah, I love that question. Unexpected. There are a couple of things that were kind of related to my expectations about working in the States in general, which I was surprised by. And this is going to sound really bad. I don't mean it in a mean or a bad way, but like it was heartening to me to see that everything's kind of a mess everywhere. I'd kind of imagined like Silicon Valley, like everything's gonna be amazing. Like the level of software is gonna be like up here, coming from New Zealand where that's not always the case. But actually everything's a mess everywhere, right? And so that was really liberating to realize. It's like, okay, like this isn't some like Ivy League kind of difference. It's actually just software is really hard no matter where you are and no matter who's working on it. It's just hard. So it was kind of like the first realization I had when I moved there. But the other thing that I think was more specific to Slack was that, and I mentioned this before, so Slack's architecture was largely, at least when I started, they weren't like at the very beginning, but they were kind of still early, but they nailed product market fit, right? Like they were taking off. They built this really successful product, and their architecture was largely based on stuff that they had built for Flickr, or like patterns that they used for Flickr. So like, many people don't know this, but the founding team for Slack, the backstory there is before they did Slack, they tried to build a video game and it didn't work out. But out of the ashes of that, they realized that they'd also built this photo sharing platform, and that was Flickr, which was a huge success. And they ended up selling to Yahoo. And then shortly after that, they left Yahoo and they tried again. They tried to build another game, which was called Glitch. And again, it was the same story. I think they would have spent maybe 4 years building that. And then eventually it didn't pan out. So they were back in the situation where it was kind of like, what are we going to do? And as part of the game development process for Glitch, they had built kind of like an IRC client with some more features on it for their own use, internally, to work together, because they were always distributed. They had people in Vancouver and America and probably other parts of the world. The founding team were kind of, I think, evenly split between Vancouver and San Francisco. I'm not sure. So they had this need, and they fixed it themselves. And then, out of the ashes of Glitch, they were like, right, we're going to make this product and we're going to call it Slack. And they productionized it essentially. And a lot of the architecture for Slack was based on patterns that they'd use in Flickr. And so it was like, at that point, it was like 10 plus years old. And they were using just a simple PHP backend. They had like a Java server for the real time. It was kind of built like a games company, right? Like they had the real time stuff going through WebSockets and a Java app. And then they had PHP for backend and APIs. And then they had a front end with just CSS and jQuery. And granted, it was like jQuery at what I would describe as like probably the highest level I've ever seen and probably ever will be. Like they did amazing things with it, but it was at its core, it was really simple. And so that taught me that you can build amazing things with simple tools. And this harks back to what I was saying around like when you're starting a company, I think you really fret about tools and frameworks and everything. How can I not shoot myself in the foot? But then you look at this experience, and Vend was similar. Like it was just at the start, it was jQuery and PHP, and these companies were built into like, Vend, I think was $500 million, Slack, obviously huge, off of this very simple core. And that was a really interesting learning and really unexpected to me, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, that's so interesting. What do you think that they were doing quite well when it came to product building that you think contributed towards their success?
They had this superpower in that they were able to dog food their own product intensely. We obviously all were using Slack all day, every day to build Slack. And that is just a amazing situation for product development. Very untypical, I think. Like most companies don't have that luxury. Like I'm building Prosaic right now, and I spend a lot of time testing the product, but it's still not to the same degree that just by virtue of using the product every day to actually do your work, that you get to test things out. And I think that was the real engine for Slack's success, was that if we were just all on it all the time, every day. It's such a powerful behavioral thing to improve, because you really feel every problem with it. And I think beyond that, the other thing, and this is kind of related to the fact that we got to use our own software, was Slack really took its time to get things right. And I'm sure, like, I have to caveat all of this to say that I wasn't intimately involved with product development. Obviously, I was on infrastructure for a lot of my time there. So if there are Slack people that were in the product org listening to this, they might have a different take. But my impression from like the outside looking in at that was that there was a lot of courage in like sending things back to the drawing board, even when they were really far along. And one example of this is threads. So Slack didn't have threads until quite late in the piece, but that was because they just tried a few different iterations and they got really close to shipping it multiple times, but still were like, it's not right. And I think we wouldn't have known that it wasn't right unless we were dog fooding every day, using it every day, like actually using it, not just like in a QA using sense, like living it. But I think that takes a little courage from leadership, right? To get that close to shipping something and be willing to tear it all down and start over.
Yeah. Was it that you would publish a version to the team and then that would be different to the, live production version?
Yeah, exactly that. So we had like feature flagging for internal use only, basically, and that was very common. It was kind of cool. I liken it to, there's a production version of a car, which is what everyone else is using. And then you've got this souped up kind of interesting experimental version. And it always gets snapped out. Like you had to be really careful, like, cause obviously when you're in Slack, you're often in multiple workspaces, and some of them I had were like just with friends back home. And like, if you wanted to screenshot stuff from the work, you'd have to like, stop, am I accidentally leaking experimental product stuff to our company? Like it's sometimes hard to know what's been shipped and what hasn't. And to this day, I'm sure they're still doing that. They're testing things out internally before everyone else gets it.
I can relate to that even, like at Dummy, we use Dummy to test our own software. And just by doing that, you realize the things that are missing as well as the user. What else do you need to add to the product? Did you guys have a way to communicate about that? Did they have like a central feedback system from, the 300 people that were working there to give it to the product people? How did that work?
So they absolutely, it was kind of, it depended a little bit on what the feedback was about. So there were basically, they were just Slack channels essentially, but there was kind of a structure around how feedback was gathered. Like if it was for a specific feature, there was usually a feature related channel, where there might even be like multiple channels relating to a specific feature, like threads development, threads feedback or something. So you would just, if you had a hot take about it, you would hop into that channel, drop it in, and people could discuss it. There was also just a general channel for ad hoc suggestions, like, oh, it'd be really cool if Slack could do such and such. And I think that worked really well when we were smaller, but I think as we got bigger, it was harder because it turned from a channel where it was kind of fun and playful and it was a few hundred people and you just crack jokes to like, do I really want to post my idea in front of 5,000 people? Like, I think it gets a bit stressful. So I don't know what they're doing now, but that's certainly how it works.
That's super interesting. And, you know, what do you think were some of the key challenges that this team faced when it came to product development?
Yeah, that's a hard one. The things that I observed was that, and I don't think this is Slack specific. Slack really struggled to develop anything that was outside its core offering. And what I kind of mean by that is like, I feel like Slack's core offering was the communication product, like the center of work, basically the replacement for email. And there were multiple, and still are multiple forays into expanding that to, for example, like we had has a posts product, which was kind of trying to compete with like Dropbox Paper at the time or like Notion, for example. And we really struggled to nail it. Like it was really hard. I vividly remember Stuart Butterfield, so he's the founder and CEO. When Microsoft launched Teams, this was a big deal for us because it was like, oh hell, the Death Star is like charging up to zap us. Because they're huge. Like we were a successful and relatively big company, but Microsoft's like, the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room. And when they launched Teams, I remember Stuart Butterfield saying to an all hands meeting something to the effect of, companies never do well outside of their core competencies. So he wasn't super worried about Teams being a serious competitor. And it's kind of like in hindsight, maybe he wasn't right about that, given what ended up happening. And I think Teams had actually been quite successful, but I think it's a different market. So it was funny that he acknowledged that, but at the same time with Slack itself, we were struggling with that, trying to do these other kind of productivity tools inside Slack, which they have struggled to nail, I think. So that was always hard. I feel like Slack never really resolved the overwhelming nature of using it on a large team. Even to this day, like I think they're doing better now that we have language models. I think maybe there was a technology limitation. We had an AI team from as early as, I want to say 2017. It was headquartered in New York, but it just didn't seem like there were some really awesome things that came out of that. But on the whole, it felt to me like that was the hope that Slack could handle the kind of, or address the issues around like people just feeling overwhelmed of like, oh my God, I've got like 1,000 unread messages. What do I do? And I'm not sure that they've completely resolved that.
That is fascinating. I think it kind of goes back a little bit towards the fact that, when they started, they built something that they assumed was for small teams. And so now you're talking about the problem of what happens when you have Slack for a really big team where you can get overwhelmed. It's just interesting to kind of look back and think about how sometimes the decisions that you make in product early on really come back to bite you in an unexpected way.
Yeah.
If you're lucky enough to be successful. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so hard to know, isn't it? Like, but how would they have known? And particularly with that one, like it was so hard to unpick because it was so fundamental to the product.
And what about like personally for you, what was the biggest challenge that you had to face while working at Slack?
So there were a couple of things. I think what I learned about myself when I was at Slack is that I much prefer the early stages than I do the kind of later, more mature stages of the company. I kind of found when Slack got bigger that it was quite stifling. And it felt like doing even relatively simple things was quite hard. And so that was definitely the kind of the first learning. The other thing that I personally really struggled with, which is a struggle that I have around all things, was just being visible in a company that large was also really intimidating for me. Visibility has always been a challenge for me, feeling visible. And so I had to really learn to get comfortable with that. And Slack was actually a great format or a great place to practice that, because there are a lot of opportunities to speak in front of your peers and stuff like that. But yeah, that was definitely a challenge for me. Having never worked at a company any bigger than Vend, which when I left was 200 people, going to a company which quickly grew to thousands of people was definitely an adjustment for me.
Did you guys have to speak in front of big teams, or was it that if you had to say something in an all hands meeting, you had to say it to like 5,000 people? Is that what happened?
Sometimes I never got up on all hands, thank God. But yeah, like there were occasions, it was very stratified. So like you'd have the all hands, which was everyone. And occasionally there would be like an engineering component to that where someone would get up and talk. But we also had the engineering all hands, which itself grew to be hundreds, if not 1,000 plus people by the time I left. We actually had a really great culture. Like Slack's front end organization was awesome, such a friendly and welcoming culture. And so we would have our own like front end syncs, we would call them, which were more like 30 to 60 people, say, towards the end. It was still a little bit intimidating, but it was a great, like, because you knew most of them really well, super like friendly, very forgiving crowd. So yeah, like it was definitely an element of which we didn't really have Zen like so much. It was just because, we were like, there wasn't heaps of structure. So there was definitely a learning curve.
Did you have to switch teams often when you worked on different projects, or were you always with the same team?
So the team that I was on was pretty stable. Like we changed managers and we changed names and there was slight reorgs all the time, but the core of the team remained the same. And we were super lucky, I think, in that we had an amazing amount of autonomy. I'm speaking about my time at Slack. Like I think a lot of the product teams there, it's a lot more, your work is kind of defined for you and you're working through the things that the designers or the product org has given you. But in infrastructure, it was very much like the Wild West. It's kind of like you were this wandering rogue and you had to figure out what needed to be fixed, and often that was just done by canvassing your peers and seeing what sucked.
So I guess when you did that, you probably then were constantly dealing with some tech debt.
Yeah. Look, I think the tech debt thing it's like, I think rebuilding is rarely the answer. It's been my experience that like, if thinking of doing it, you need to really scrutinize your reasoning for it. I think often it's viewed as a kind of a escape hatch and everything's going to be better. And that really pans out. Like, and I don't think Slack, I don't think then we're great at this. I think it's just a perennially hard problem in software. One of the things that I was involved in when I was at Slack was, the project was called Sonic. It was like, we were rebuilding the client in React, essentially. One of the ways that worked well was that we didn't rebuild everything from scratch, but React let us drop React components or like basically eat up smaller parts of the client bit by bit, rather than having to start completely from scratch. I think the emoji picker in Slack was the first thing that we Reactized. And it was like the small thing that just like wasn't even there until you opened it. And we made that React. And then that gave us a way to kind of like work from the inside out rather than rebuild. And so I think if you're trying to address tech debt, if you can do that, which you can't always, right? We were lucky in that React allowed us to do that. But if you can do that, it's a way better way to resolve it. And obviously it's painful. Like it was a really long, really difficult project, but ultimately it meant that we were able to keep shipping features while we were modernizing the product. And I think if we hadn't done that, if we had tried to just like rebuild everything from scratch, we would be years behind where Slack is now.
Have you ever seen a case where somebody decided to rebuild a piece of the software and it went not well? And you thought, oh, we should have just kind of carried on with what we had and built on top of it.
Yeah, I think that's quite common. Like I said, there's kind of this like reach for new technology, the new shiny, like I want to use the new shiny. It's often the case that it just kind of fizzles out. Usually management loses patience with it, right? If you can't do something quickly, it gets dropped. And that's what I've seen happen repeatedly. So I think it's so important to try and find a way to do it so that you keep up at least some cadence of improvements or like feature shipping while you're addressing it.
What kind of things do you think somebody needs to consider when making that decision of rebuild versus, just fix some tech debt and continue carrying it on?
So some of the stuff that came up when we were rebuilding the Slack client was kind of forward looking in the sense that because the original version was built in jQuery, um, and the industry at large had long moved on from that, what started to happen is we would get people that we would hire and familiar with jQuery because they might have started their career with React, for example. I think it's important when you're thinking about a rebuild to keep that in mind that, I had this manager at Slack who always used to quip that most of our engineers haven't started yet. And that's a really great forward-looking way to think about like any given company, right? Even if you're a 1,000-person company, because of employee turnover and everything else, and because just companies generally continue for 20, 30 years, maybe longer, most of the engineers haven't even been hired yet. If you look at all the engineers that a company will hire over its entire lifetime. And so I think that is one of the few reasons where I feel like a rebuild has some merit, is where hiring becomes the constraint because you can't hire people to work on the system, or you can, but you have to spend so much resource on retraining them or training them how in your special dark art of jQuery or whatever. But again, I think you really need to temper your excitement about the shiny new, that is a really alluring thing for programmers. It's really hard to resist, and there's a lot of noise out there. Like you go on Twitter and you look at like the influency kind of engineer people, and they're always like, hey, I built this like app in like 5 minutes and it's amazing. And it took 3 lines of code, and it's always important to remind yourself like, yeah, that took 10 minutes because it's a to-do list. Like the real politique of building your product in this thing is that you're going to have a lot of the same problems that you already had now. So it's not going to solve anything for you. And you've spent 6 months rebuilding, so you've lost that time.
Having seen kind of under the hood of those two companies that were growing quickly and were obviously very successful, is there anything that you learned that you will avoid doing in your own startup now? You can point.
Great question. This harks back to what I was saying about everything everywhere is kind of a mess, and that's okay. Like that's probably like, that's what comes to mind when I hear this question. And obviously I'm extremely biased because most of my work at Slack was in this realm. But what I gained from my time there was that one of the most important things for the velocity of your teams is developer experience, having good developer experience. And so making sure that you consistently invest in that, I think, is really important. And I don't think many companies do this. This is one of the cool things about living in the Bay, is that at one point I was kind of casting about for ideas about how to improve our developer experience at Slack. And as part of that, I just reached out to people that I thought had done great work in this area at some of the big companies. And like, because I was in the Bay Area, it's like, I can just drive up the road and meet with this guy that developed this huge internal system for Facebook or like Dropbox, like that was one of the things which I feel like was really cool about working in the Bay Area, was that you had this kind of access. It was just, you could just go have a coffee with someone and pick their brains, and they're willing to speak to you, and you're physically in the same area. And I feel like one of the keys to Facebook's success, at least from what I gathered from those conversations, was that they just put a lot of energy into making developer experience amazing. Like any engineer could like spin up a whole service and just get hacking and do whatever they wanted. If you kind of gatekeep those things in an organization, innovation gets stifled, because you always have people that just want to kind of scratch their own itch. And if you don't let them do that, it hurts morale. It slows development down generally. Like it's this kind of hidden cost, which I think is not often recognized. That's probably the main thing that comes to mind. It's like just investing and making things really quick and easy for anyone to solve for themselves, like making your development experiences as self-serve as you can.
And when you talk about that developer experience, it's more about having the freedom to kind of tinker around with the stuff that you're interested in. Or yeah, if you had to say like this is the most important part of developer experience, what would it be?
I think you've nailed it. So to give you a concrete example, at Slack, when there was a group of people that were interested in converting us from jQuery to React, them being able to just like spin up an ad hoc build process somewhere on a server and just test things out would have been really helpful. It's kind of like what I was saying at the very beginning about being able to like take something apart and do what you're interested in doing without there being too many limits on that or it being too hard.
Yeah, so it's kind of like letting people do their own side projects within the company that are related to the product and kind of giving them the opportunity to see if that would be helpful and useful to then implement later on to the product.
Yeah, that's a major side of it. And then the other one is just performance. Just make sure that your unit tests run quickly and your build process isn't slowing everything down. We struggle with this constantly at Slack. If you have a slow deployment process, you're slower to deploy the things that you want, and you're also slower to respond in an emergency. And like, so these things are actually a lot more important than I think that most people realize.
And since working on your own startup, has your approach to product building changed at all? Were there any challenges that you didn't expect to have?
The most important thing that I have had to internalize around about the time that we were starting Prosaic, I read this awesome, it's a book, but it's also just an essay or a series of essays by this guy, Paul Graham, who's the Y Combinator guy. It's called Hackers and Painters. And in this, he likens the process of building software to be more like sculpture or painting than science, in the sense that you start with like a blank canvas or like a slab of rock, and you just start like chiseling away, and you kind of pull the software. The process is not like, you don't sit there and look around the rock and have all these detailed drawings. And so my whole process around Prosaic has been like, just build this thing. And granted, we have so many great tools to make this feasible now. It's like we have these component libraries which are really fully featured, and so you don't necessarily need to design as much as you used to. You can just throw things together and just like use it. And so my ethos is really just to get things in people's hands as quickly as possible, and then like listen really closely to them. Whereas I think if I hadn't had these experiences, I hadn't really internalized what Paul Graham was saying about software development. It's like you would spend a lot more time just squirreled away, not showing people your work until you feel like it's finished. Whereas actually you just give them a half-working thing, which kind of sucks, and you know it sucks and it kind of breaks, but like at least they're kind of like, oh yeah, this part's cool, this part sucks. And like just doing that over and over and over again, I think is really valuable. And the other thing I've realized that morale is everything in a startup. You know, like it's such a roller coaster. Like some weeks you feel like you're on top of the world. And then there are whole stretches where you're like, this isn't going to work. Like, we're going to shut this company down. Like, I don't know. And it's really important to maintain your morale as a team, right? I mean, I'm sure you've experienced this with Dummy. It's like you have setbacks, you have successes. As a team, you need to like be able to prop each other up and feel like you're working towards it. Like the general trend is positive and that you feel positive about it. Because I think a lot of startups flame out because they get demoralized and they give up. So that's something that I hadn't considered before. It was like I was working on my own startup, on my own company. I guess in companies I was looking for, other people were thinking about that. The founding team thought about that, and you're not really privy to that.
100%. Yeah, when you are the founder, you kind of are in charge of making sure that happens. Like you said, things go up and down. We definitely feel it at Dummy as well. But when you have a solid team where everyone really trusts each other and supports each other, you know that even if it doesn't work out, you've learned a lot and you got to build something with great people, and that's all that matters. But yeah, I can definitely relate.
And you got to try and enjoy the journey too, right? This is something my grandpa used to say to me. He's like, have fun. Like, don't forget to have fun. But it's important. These moments are fleeting. You're only going to be two people sitting, like, if successfully, you're only going to be two people sitting at a desk, and you'll look back at this time and like miss it.
For sure. I love that. For anyone wanting to, kind of do the same thing that you've done and go to the US and work for a tech company out there, do you have any tips of what to do and not to do?
Man, I have I could speak for a whole hour about how to interview well in America because I think that is a skill into itself. And if any of your listeners are hearing this and want to know more, please reach out to me. I'm happy to talk about it. I think the main thing is I think it's important to think really hard about who you want to work for. And I think every company has its own flavor and it's important to find the one that you like. And so really doing your homework before you apply and you start interviewing is important. You need to really know what these companies are about, what it's like to work there. And there's so many all of them will have engineering blogs because that's a hiring piece, and so doing your homework ahead of time and then picking who you want to work for, I think is really important. But if you're interviewing in the States, buckle up. It's hard work, but it's worth it. It was an awesome experience. I recommend it to anyone. I'm really glad I did it. You don't have to go to the Bay Area. I think there are plenty of places around the world which are similar tech hubs right now, or even within America. New York's amazing, got an amazing software community there. It was life-changing for me in many, many ways.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rowan. It's been really lovely to have you on the podcast. And if anyone wants to ask any questions to Rowan, let us know and we can connect you guys. But yeah, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Juliet.
Hope you enjoyed this podcast and thank you so much for listening. We release new episodes every 2 weeks, so make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts so you don't miss a new episode. I'll see you in a couple of weeks.